Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Today we're still working on our Deck the Halls quilt for the holidays, and today we're talking about sashing. So join us right after this and we'll talk about how to make sure that when you're using a directional fabric, it all looks right when you get the project done. We'll be right back. And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Well, welcome back, and today we're talking about sashing. And if you recall, the project we're working on in this book has a gingham sashing on the blocks. And as I stated before, I wasn't able to find a gingham that was suitable for this quilt. But what I did find was kind of a stripe that to me looked a little bit like Christmas candy or ribbon candy or candy canes. I guess maybe it's the candy canes that I'm thinking about. So I thought that would look really good. But then after I bought the fabric, I start thinking about how are we going to position all of that sashing to make sure that it looks like a cohesive unit all put together. So I sat down and started thinking about how am I going to do this? And my first reaction was to cut a straight line because after I got it home and pre-washed it, it was all wonky. And especially with something like this that's on the diagonal, you want to make sure that you're cutting it straight. So I got that straight line cut and I cut out one strip for the sashing. And let's see, what size do they tell us that should be? The sashing is 2.5 inches wide. So I cut that strip 2.5 inches wide with the fabric and I started cutting. And the first thing I realized was in a strip, I was only getting 2 pieces of sashing. And I realized that I needed to make sure that that was the most effective way to use our fabric, because two pieces of sashing, that would mean you'd need 2 strips for every block, and there's 12 blocks, that's 24 strips times 2.5, and we're quickly up to a yard of fabric because you've had to excuse me, you've had to cut off some on both ends to make it straight. And then you have to allow for a few extra cuts just because sometimes our rotary blade slips or we mismeasure and we're cutting 2 inches instead of 2.25. So you have to kind of prepare yourself so that you have enough material and you have a good grasp on what you need to do. So, directionality of the quilt. I wanted to make sure that all the stripes were going in the same direction. So it was almost like you had taken a huge piece of this stripe material and set those blocks on top of it. That was the look I was going for. So I needed to make sure that they all went in the same direction. But almost as importantly, I wanted that fabric to be cut as if it were sitting on this fabric, just those blocks. So what I decided to do was the first thing, let's turn this over. I think I can explain it a little bit better. So here is my line that I cut straight, and I tried to ensure that we were perpendicular, number one, to our selvage edge. I think that's right off camera. Our selvage edge here, the line we cut was perpendicular. And then using the 45-degree line on our ruler, then I could double check to make sure that we were still working pretty closely to the design being at that 45-degree angle as well. Gotta love high school geometry. They say you'll never use it, but if you're a quilter, you know you do. Now, then after I had made that strip and I decided that that was not necessarily the way to go, it might work for some things, but for our process, my process, it wasn't going to work. So what I did is I looked back at the size of that sashing, and it is 2.5 by 14.5. And all of the sashing is the same size, whether it's the sashing that's horizontal or the sashing that's vertical. And what I decided to do was to cut a strip with the fabric at about 15 inches. So that's a 1/2 inch wider than we need our sashing to be. And then I started cutting 2.5 inch strips. So I cut this big swath of fabric and then cut those so that every piece for those ran horizontal. So I counted the number of horizontal pieces I needed, and that's how many I cut. It was just about all of them. There was a little bit of fabric left, but it was almost all of them. Then I turned my attention to the sashing that sat vertical on the quilt, and I counted how many those were, and then I cut those with the fabric, so that every piece of sashing was cut with an intended placement, either horizontal or vertical. And I think I'm going to show you at this point, I'm going to swing the camera around and put it in post, how it's looking, because I've got it hanging up over here, just the top half of it, and it's all put together with the sashing and the cornerstones. And I love it. It's just perfect. It's better than I thought it was going to be. So we're going to look at that, maybe while you're listening to me, to see what it looks like. Very, very happy with it. I used my little invisible marker that I use for quilting to designate whether the piece was a horizontal piece or a vertical piece. And I just did that with a little dot and a V, just to distinguish the two so I didn't get them messed up. Now, pattern-wise, they were interchangeable, but the way the fabric was woven, I wanted to keep them similar so that we were consistent. So if the fabric stretched one way over time, at least the whole quilt would stretch that way. That was my thought process. And it may have been extra work that I didn't necessarily need to do. It didn't really take much more time, so I was pleased with that. So the next step was to put the sashing on the blocks. And every single block has a top sashing, a side sashing, and a bottom sashing. And then some of them have an extra sashing or two. So I started with the horizontal sashing. And what I did, let's see if we've got a loose one here. I do right here. I decided, oops, that's not a loose one. Here's a loose one. This one I've prepared for 3. But what I did was I found the side that had the longest white border, and I designated that as the top of the block. And I put on just the candy stripe sashing that we had cut and designated as a horizontal. So I did all my blocks with that. Then the next thing I did was I pulled from my vertical section and I attached the little cornerstone and sewed that section on going down. And now from there, that's when I started thinking about how I'm going to assemble these blocks and what were the next pieces that I needed. Because when you're putting all of them together, they don't all need 4 sashings. Most of them only need 2. So I assembled 2 blocks with 2 sashings for each row. And then the third block on that row would also need a sashing on, so you have the top and the side. And then for the ones on that first row, then they needed one more sashing on this side. So they needed that little green piece put on and a vertical sashing added. So now you have a three-sided block. You sew that three-sided block to the two-sided block to the two-sided block, and you've got your first row. Now you're going to repeat that process for your second and your third row. And when you get to the fourth row, if you're making a 12-block quilt top, you're also going to need a bottom row. And we're going to do that the exact same way. You just want to be careful that you don't put yourself into a position where you've got 3 stripes and then this last piece you sew it on and then your green corner piece is missing. On some of these, what you're going to have to do is lay that fourth piece down when you get to the fourth row, and you're going to mark where that seam matches, and then mark that on your fabric, and then lay your green piece. Well, actually, I marked that on my fabric and then I cut it 1/4 of an inch longer, and then I used that as the end and attached the cornerstone. And that gave me a piece to put all the way across. And that last one, that last row, you're going to have one block with all its sashing on it, all 4 sides, and then you're going to have a block with 3 sides and a block with 3 sides. Now, don't let all this information overwhelm you. Just take it one block at a time. And when you're assembling it, it will be easy peasy. So let me do this. I've got this one block. This is going to be the very last block on the bottom. And it's got 3 sides attached. And what I need to do with this one is I need to attach this 4th side. It's going to be the same kind of sewing that we've been doing. We're using our 1/4 inch foot, our standard stitch that is 8.3 inches wide. Oh, no, excuse me. The setting is 8.3. I don't know what that means, but that's just what comes up. But the length we set to 2.4. And we're just going to stitch that. Now this is one that I've added that cornerstone on to complete it. Okay, I'm going to take our pins out real quick. I like to put a lot of these on because I had a couple of them I had to re-sew. The fabric underneath had slipped back too far and I didn't have enough seam allowance. Okay, so there's that. We've got all 4 sashings on this. Now, if you're in the mood to make an extra block, you can make an extra block and add the sashing on it, and that would make just the cutest little pillow covering. It would also make a great little wall hanging that you could finish up with another border or on its own. That would be a cute decoration if you simply don't have the time, the money, or the desire to have a bigger quilt project. As I stated before, if this project is bigger than what you wanted, you could do 2 or 3 of these, depending on the size you needed, as a table runner or a wall hanging. You could put 4 of these together to have a cute little decoration to use for a lot of different purposes. You could go with a 2x3 block setup. You could go with a 3x3, a 3x4, a 4x4. You can get it bigger and bigger, however you want to do it. And you always have the option of adding another border around the outside. I think what I'm going to do is I have, like I said, the 6 that I showed you a moment ago put together, and I'm going to go ahead and finish this last row. I want to show you the 3 pieces and how it goes together. And let's see, that one's not finished yet. I think I have, what do we have here? This is the 3rd row. I think that goes with that one. And then this, I think that's the 1st block, the 2nd block, and the 3rd block. Okay, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I've got one seam here, and then we're going to sew these together, and I'm going to show you really quickly how that last row goes together. We've put that sashing on that block. Now normally I would press these before we move forward, but most of this pressing is just what I call kind of normal pressing. It's not so intricate that it has to be done before we move forward. Sometimes if you have small pieces, you really need to press before you move. So, okay, let's, how are we going to do this? We've got this 1st block. It's got the borders all around. And then we've got the next block that's going to join to it. It's got borders on 3 sides. And then the next block is exactly the same. So I think what we'll do is we'll sew these 2 together, and then we'll sew the 3rd one on. The one thing that I was super careful with the whole quilt was making sure that those horizontal lines stayed horizontal. And because I chose this longer white sashing or longer white borders on these blocks to be the horizontal, I can quickly look at these and make sure that they are set horizontal like we want them to. The only thing we need to do before we sew is we need to trim that seam up, because it makes it much easier when you're sewing not to have to guess where that seam line is. We're going to pull this out just a little bit as if it had been pressed, because it has not, and that will affect your ability to square it. And I always look not only on the outside line, but kind of in the seam lines here to make sure we're pretty close to where we need to be. A little bit off is not going to make a difference, nor is anybody really going to be able to tell. Okay, and this one here needs to be trimmed. And again, I'm kind of pulling that snug to simulate if it were pressed. Okay, and we're just cutting that little bit right there off. Okay, otherwise, this block looks like it's trimmed. Okay, long vertical lines, long vertical lines, long vertical lines. So we've got them all lined up here. So what we're going to start with is we're going to start with sewing these 2 together. The nice thing about the way these blocks are put together is the fact that we're sewing long pieces of fabric together. We're not sewing a bunch of little pieces. So there are very few areas where we're going to run into situations where we have to be careful about matching seams or getting seams turned over on us when we're sewing. So we're going to put a pin here where these seams match and at the end, and we're going to do the same on the other side. Some of these seams, the way they're pressed, are nesting together, and that is just my favorite because you don't have to worry too much about matching it up if you match the way those seams are folded. So again, one pin there at the seam, one on the end, and then what we'll probably do is put a couple in the middle just to make sure that what I talked about just a minute ago doesn't happen, and we keep those fabrics lined up with each other so we don't have one slipping away underneath. Okay, so we really only have to worry about a couple of seams. The ones underneath I think are going to be fine, but what we're going to do is we're going to flip it over and look real quick to make sure we're lined up, and then we're just going to go. Okay, there's those two sewn together. I think we've covered a lot of concepts in this video, but they're all fairly simple. Now look at that, would you? The way those things came together, we've got a perfect match there with our pieces, and you can see now where we've sewn those together that all of that striping goes in the same direction. It almost looks like it's not been cut, that something has just been sat on top of it. Okay, now we're going to add this third block. This is the one that with the, I can't talk. This is the one with the sashings all around, and we're going to sew it right onto this one. We're going to leave, this is the seam we just sewed on. We'll put it on the outside because it needs to be pressed and it'll be easier out there. But either way would be acceptable. We've got those together, and we're just going to pin them together the same way. If we can nest those seams, that's the best. I'm going to come back to the end of that just a second. They should pretty much fit together pretty nicely. Because we have so few seams, that does make it just very nice, very easy to go together. Okay, and then here on the end, I need to pull that out just a little bit. And then I'm going to sit it down because that one looks a little off, and I think it's because if we tidy up those lines so that they're even, then it fits on there better. I think it was cut just a little bit crooked, but very, very little. So we should be able to just adjust our seam slightly and run along the edge of that stripe fabric. So easy. When you're working in the center of these blocks and you've got all the pieces that have to go together and you've got to press them and put more pieces and more pieces, by the time you get to the outside and you're just putting the sashes together, it's such a dream. Okay, so here we go. There it is. Now this one here on this end, well, we'll turn it the other way because that's the way you saw it before. This one was the one that had sashing on all 3 sides. And then these two only had the sashing on 3 sides. Remember, this is the very bottom strip. So we've sewn them together and we get to this last one, and this is the one where we finish up all the sashing. It's a little different, so that's why I wanted to cover this one. And that's that last strip of this quilt. Let me give you some thoughts on this one before we move any further. I have really enjoyed this. There was a point when I was assembling all the inner units that it got a little confusing for me because I don't know whether I didn't cut them right. I thought I didn't cut them. I thought I cut some things the wrong size. And as I started putting it together, and I had like 6 blocks made and 6 blocks to do, then I got to thinking about what I had cut, and what I had cut was right. I don't know whether my mind took a vacation there for a little while, but anyway, it all came together. I had a few more pieces that I had to cut to finish it up and round it out. I'm always cautious that I don't overcut because that will quickly turn a fun project into a nightmare when you find out you've miscut and you've run out of fabric. So I did not want that to happen. And I wanted to make sure we had enough to get all 12 blocks done. So we have our 3 blocks by 4 blocks. But there it is with the stripes. Now I need to finish up my 3rd row. I've got row 1 and 2 done and all sewn together. I've got row 4 done now. It just needs to be pressed. I need to finish up row 3, and then I'll have the entire quilt top together. And let me just say that by the time I got to cutting the sashing out, the project turned from something, I would say, moderately difficult, slightly more than a beginner, but certainly a beginner who is well focused can do this project. By the time I got to the sashing, all the difficult parts had faded away. And if you had something that was non-directional as your sashing, you could stitch this thing together in no time at all. It's been a really fun project, and it has gone together really quickly. I think that a lot of times the project is either very difficult and time-consuming, or it's an easy project and trying to film it makes it difficult. This one, it was about similar. There were some times that it was kind of tedious, but trying to focus it into just 6 episodes where we moved through it really efficiently and quickly was added a little bit of stress to it because I'm trying to get it finished so I can release it to you in time. But the project itself is very doable, and it's just a charming look to it. Just fun. It just screams fun. And by the time we get this all done and put together, it's just going to be something special, I think. Now, I picked out some background fabric at the store last weekend, and it probably was not my first pick. What I really wanted for the background was something that looked like old-fashioned wrapping paper, maybe with some Santa Clauses on it or some reindeer or something, maybe even something a little bit vintage, but they didn't have anything like that in these colors. To me, these colors are a little bit Grinchy. It has that little influence of the Grinch character. But it is very fun. So I found a little polka dot that's a couple of shades of green and a red on a white background. We're going to use as the background, the backing fabric for this. And just judging by the fabric I have left, this polka dot is going to be the binding because I have the most of it left, It's easy to get more if I need to get more. It's not a seasonal fabric, so it's easy to get more. And I probably have at least a yard, maybe a yard and a half of that left. So that'll be great. And it'll go with the background fabric as well. I think that trying to make a binding out of this would be really cute, but not binding it on itself, because the seams are all going to get confused. If we do a bias, then those stripes are going to be straight stripes, and these stripes are going to be angle stripes. So that's just a headache we don't need. Now, I haven't thoroughly decided whether I'm going to put another little like white or maybe green, I don't know, a little small border around the whole thing. That I've not quite decided on. And I think it's going to depend when I get all 4 rows together, how big it really is. Because I want to make sure that it's not so big that we don't feel like we should use it for Christmas. And I don't want it to be so big that it becomes a storage problem, because this is probably not something that's going to stay out all year. It's going to be packed up. So I don't think I'm going to go with another border, but we'll see how that goes as we get closer. So we finished everything. We should, with the techniques that I've shared today, have the whole top finished. We only need to cover sandwiching and quilting. Now, I am going to quilt this on the machine. I don't have enough time to finish this project and share it with you doing it by hand, and I've already got something on my quilt frame. So we are going to do it by machine. It's going to be a very simple quilting though. We are probably going to be just stitching in the ditch, something around the blocks, somehow incorporating around this design. I don't necessarily want to stitch through the design, but that makes it a little more difficult when you're doing it by machine. So I'm going to have to think through that and do it pretty quickly, because I need to get that filmed so I can get it out to you. So next time we're together, we will be sandwiching and we will be starting the machine quilting. Also keeping in mind how large this is and the border. We don't want to add a border and make it even bigger, because even at the size it is now, it's going to be a challenge to get that in here and quilt it by machine. I think we can do it. I am going to probably use the warm and white, because I love the fact that it is nice crisp white, and when you're working with a white quilt, it looks really nice underneath it. I find the warm and white is not quite as heavy as some of the others, not quite as hot, and I don't like them hot. I like them warm. I like them so that they capture your body heat and help keep you warm, but I don't want it so heavy that I can't move underneath it. So we'll do that, and then so we'll finish up with sandwiching and starting our machine quilting next time, and then our final episode is going to be about binding and how we bind this and finish product. So we've got 2 more episodes left. I hope you've enjoyed this. I thoroughly have enjoyed making this quilt top so far. If you would please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Be sure to share it with a friend, and if you get started now, you still have time to pull it off. We'll see you next time at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Bye.